about at 15 psi. It's really starting to flow and getting chunky air bubbles starting to come through the line. What is going on, everyone? Today we're going to be working on the FRS, and what we'll be showing you how to do is how to bleed the brakes on a car with just your own two hands, so not having a second person. That's always one of the most complicated things about bleeding the brakes, is that you kind of have to wait for the availability of another pair of hands or another set of feet in the case of pumping the brakes. But we're going to show you two different methods today on how to do it by yourself. There's going to be a fast method as well as a much slower method. So the fast method actually involves a specialized tool called the power bleeder. Now, how this thing works is actually quite simple. So it's a bottle with a pump that you can pressurize, and at the other end is a cap that's specially fitted for your brake reservoir. So essentially what it's going to do is pressurize the brake reservoir such that when you release the bleed screw at the caliper, the fluid will flow. Essentially what this tool does is simulates a constant pressure that replaces the pressure that you're building with the brake pedal and the master cylinder. We're mostly going to be covering how to do it the fast way because I am in a bit of a time crunch. We're trying to get this car ready back on the road so that we can take it to driven and get the motor swap underway. But the slow method is pretty similar in that we're not going to use any active pressure in the system, but we're going to make use of gravity, and it's called the gravity bleed method, just as the name suggests. And how that works is like this. If we take a look at the brake fluid reservoir in the FRS, it's actually at essentially the highest spot possible in the engine bay. And the gravity bleed method makes use of filling the reservoir and knowing that the caliper on the vehicle is at a much lower point in the car. And so with the help of gravity, the brake fluid is actually going to flow naturally by itself into whatever catch you have at the bottom. And the rule of thumb there is essentially when you can see a steady stream starting to flow, starting to drip, and the fluid color is that of new fluid, right? That's usually the best way to tell. If you don't have a hose on it to be able to actually visually see the bubbles, you kind of do it based on color. And the reason why I call this the very slow method is that for each corner it can take up to an hour. But you know, if it's a Sunday afternoon and you got nothing else going on, just have to check up on the car every once in a while as you go through each of the corners, and you won't have an issue. One more other piece of advice before we get started with this bleed is the order of the calipers that you should bleed them in. So conventional wisdom is that you should go from the furthest caliper first relative to the brake reservoir. So for a left-hand drive vehicle, usually what that means is passenger rear, driver rear, passenger, and driver. This can also apply to calipers that you have to bleed both the outside and the inside. So when we think about the front, let's say we're doing the passenger front, we want to do the outside first, then the inside, because the relative distance to the reservoir is closer on the inside. In terms of the brakes, we're going to be reinstalling some fresh AP Racing CP 8350s. Now, if you're fans of our channel and of the cars that we build, you know that this is the caliper that we basically slap on every single car, mostly because the pad shape is super common. It's only like $600 per caliper to get them through Essex, and what I like about it is actually this gray kind of raw aluminum look to it. It means that not only does it look pretty good with the yellow lettering, with excess heat, you're not going to have discoloration like you do with like red Brembos. It basically turn kind of like an ox blood color after a track day. So yeah, let's just slap these back on. It should be a pretty quick job, and we'll get to the bleeding. Now that the caliper's in there, we're going to torque these down 23 foot-pounds. One thing that you have to remember is before you start bleeding, you need to have pads in here, of course, right? Otherwise, that's one thing that's like really easy to forget. If you don't, the pistons are basically going to eject themselves. So now we are going to plumb the line. So we have this Spangler stainless steel line here, and it is I'm trying to get it focused. This is a banjo fitting, so we're gonna have a banjo bolt that goes through, copper on each side, and it will go on to where this yellow cap is, just kind of keeping it clean. Now our banjo bolt is secured. I like to basically have it in the vertical orientation with the caliper just to keep it straight, because we want to make sure that the line does not bind. And this is actually a pretty good test already, because we are at full lock to the outside and the line looks pretty good. All we have to do is slap in the pads and then we can get to the other side. We are basically fully plumbed at that point. We can start pressurizing the brake fluid reservoir. The brake fluid of choice for us has always been Endless RF 650. Now the reason why we like to go with endless fluid, even though it's like so ridiculously expensive, is it's kind of like the same thing why you would upgrade to a big brake kit, in that pads are usually thicker, they last longer, they won't glaze. You know, over the long term, it kind of pays back if you go pretty frequently to the track, as we do. And the same kind of principles with brake fluid. So has a much higher boiling temp, and it is better performing at preventing water and moisture from the air from mixing in with the fluid. And the reason why that matters is we know that when water boils, it becomes a gas, and therefore there goes your nice and stiff brake pedal, right? So go with this. Honestly, I don't even flush my brakes every year when it comes to tracking. Maybe a bleed every 5 or 6 track days whenever I feel that the pedal is feeling a little bit mushy. But yeah, this will just last such a long time. Every single car that I take to track, I put this in there, even my GTI, which is my daily driver. Okay, so we're gonna get started with pressurizing the bottle and putting the cap on the reservoir. So the thing to watch out for when you're purchasing this power bleeder, so this one is by Motive. There may be some knockoffs, but I think Motive is the one that first had this product. They're about like 60 to 80 bucks online, I think. Definitely less than $100. So what you'll need to get is one of these fittings that go on top of your brake fluid reservoir, and this one is specifically made to fit the FRS. So just watch out for this when you purchase this product. These are not universal, but they do fit many different brands. Because we're going to be sealing up the reservoir with this cap and pressurizing, we want to add fluid into the reservoir first. And you can kind of overfill it for our purposes because we know we're going to drain a lot. The other way to do this is if you're doing a lot of cars at once, you can actually put the fluid in the jug itself, and it will actually push fluid into the reservoir as it needs to. So Motive recommends that we do not exceed 15 psi when we pressurize, so we'll heed that warning. All right, so let's get pumping. Okay, so as you can see, we are just about at 15 psi, and you should see that it holds pressure. If it is leaking, then you know, assuming that there's no leaks in the bleeder apparatus itself, there may be a leak somewhere else in your line, and you should check your lines and your calipers, etc. One of the other things to be mindful of, as with any brake change, is monitor the fluid levels in the reservoir as you're bleeding out. Because if it ever gets empty, we're just going to be introducing a lot more air back into the system. And especially because we have new calipers, we're going to go through that first bit of fluid quite quickly. Let's get cracking with the bleeding. With the AP caliper, we have 2 bleed screws on each caliper. So one on the outboard and one on the inboard. So this is a 7/16 single screw, which is kind of nice because the Willwoods will have a double screw, and sometimes it makes a mess and is known to kind of cause problems down the line. So I'm actually a big fan of the AP Racing single screw here. All you have to do is remove the nipples and crack the line just a little bit so that the, oh wow, that took way longer than it should have. What we're gonna do is attach a bottle and a hose to this so that we can catch the fluid as it drains. So one of the things I hate about doing this is the rubber always hardens, and you gotta have to take your time to work its way soft again to get it onto the bleed nipple. But just take your time, work your way on. We're almost there. This way, at least it creates a tight seal because of how much effort you have to put into it to get it to fit. We're almost there. I think we are good. Okay, so once we start opening this nipple, we should start to hear, and I'm already hearing some fluid come through somewhere in the system, but it hasn't gone to the caliper yet. Just checking the PSI, pressure is still good. All right, so if we take a look here, right where my hand is, we see fluid starting to trickle through. There's tons of bubbles, but we're gonna get rid of that. Just open the bleed just a tiny bit more. You don't really have to do too much, like probably half a turn. And you can see now it's really starting to flow and we're getting chunky air bubbles starting to come through the line. And that's all good. So we're just going to keep doing this until we get a solid line without bubbles. Okay, so let's take a closer look. The fluid in the line is very solid, no bubbles. And the rule of thumb when it comes to tightening these is Essex recommends, so Essex distributes for AP Racing, no more pressure than what you can exert with one finger. So I know it's like a little bit tough because, you know, different people, different strengths, but that kind of just tells you, like, go easy on it, don't strip it. And if we take a look at the cleanliness when you use a bottle and a tube, I'm gonna get my finger in there so focus. Not a single drop of fluid anywhere. This is great. After finishing that one side of the caliper, we see that we're getting close to the midline, almost near the midline on the reservoir. So I'm actually gonna depressurize the bottle and add a bit more fluid. Would be nice for the bottle for a future design to come with like a bleed. So, you know, you just, whoops. So that maybe you can just like pull on a bleed nipple and just depressurizes. But you basically just have to unscrew the cap and go from there. So we just wrapped up bleeding both sides of each caliper. Before you call this a completed job, we actually want to get in the car and just pump the brakes to do two things. One, the pistons are still somewhat retracted even though the lines are plumbed and it's free of air. We want the pistons to be against the pad so that first time you go for a drive, you're not caught off guard and, you know, you go brakes to the floor and the car is not stopping. The other thing we want to do is just do a standing brake test. So what that is you pump the brakes until they're rock hard. You keep the pressure there, hold it for 20-30 seconds and see if there's any loss in pressure after it gets hard. So if there is, then it kind of tells you that there's a leak somewhere in the system. All right, that's gonna be it for this video. The reason why we want to install the brakes today and bleed the system is because we want to get the car out to driven as part of our larger track build series is doing the K24 turbo swap into this car. We need to get it out over to the shop so we can get started with the teardown. And the first thing we're going to do is actually ripping out the FA20. FA20 delete on the way. We'll catch you on the next one.